The type of government is completely authoritarian, very dictatorial, in fact, very theocratical.
Arian, you were part of the former government, but you were able to go back. How did you manage your own safety and security and risk when you were moving through Afghanistan? Because I assume the Taliban knew who you were and your previous role in the government. There must have been significant risks to you personally.
It was basically a political defeat, Dominique, not a military defeat on the side of the Afghan government.
Hi, I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm the host of the International Risk Podcast. And Afghanistan is back on the front page, and for the worst reasons. 2 earthquakes since the 31st of August have killed over 1,400 people and flattened villages across the east of the country. And it's also back on the world's chessboard because of Russia's actions, because of the formal recognition of the Taliban back in July. And similarly, ISIS-K is projecting violence into Iran and Russia and across the border with Pakistan. And interestingly, the economy shows statistical stability whilst we know that poverty continues to deepen right across the communities. There's about 23 million people in need of humanitarian assistance this year. Funding for Afghanistan humanitarian operations is falling, and this is all occurring at the same time as the macro data looks stable, low inflation, tiny growth, but there's high poverty. And any deals made between the Afghanistan government or businesses in Afghanistan and foreign actors faces sanctions. And at the same time, opium output has collapsed by 95% after the Taliban ban. And so this will be really interesting to hear from our guest today about the impacts on local communities. And to join us today, we're joined by Dr. Arian Sharifi. He's the Chief Strategy Officer at PerkEdge Research. He was a lecturer and chair of the Masters in Public Policy program at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, and he's the former Director General of the National Threat Assessment at the Office of National Security in the government of Afghanistan, and he also served as a senior advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Kabul. I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Dr. Sharifi today to understand the situation in Afghanistan today. Dr. Arian Sharifi, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Glad to be here.
In July, Moscow became the first to formally recognize the Taliban. The Supreme Court in Russia had already lifted the terrorist designation back in April, but formal recognition is another step towards legitimizing the current rulers in Afghanistan. What tangible changes actually follow with this recognition? Is it access to finance? Is it air links between Afghanistan and Russia? Is there more diplomatic channels? Or is this mainly about optics for Russia's regional posture?
I would think it's the latter. It's more something in the public eye. Because the formal recognition by one country really does not lead to any tangible result, especially when we come to diplomatic recognition. Is basically, in terms of tangible results, countries are looking for mainly entrance into the Bretton Woods system, basically, and that has really 3 main pillars. They need representation at the United Nations, representations at the World Bank, and representation at the IMF. And none of that has happened. And none of that will happen unless the Taliban government is recognized, by most of the countries, particularly the Western countries. So in terms of tangible results, Russia's recognition so far has not really led to anything. I think the Russians were kind of hoping that, as they step in, other countries would follow. But thus far, at least 2-3 months has passed, and nothing really has happened to that end yet.
The promise of the Taliban 2.0 was public order, was better governance. And these are the things that the Taliban promised: reduction in corruption and better services and support for the people of Afghanistan. In practice, we've seen gender apartheid, and we've had guests on the podcast to speak about that. We've seen clerical centralization in Kandahar and Kabul. So from your vantage point, when you look at state capacity in Afghanistan in 1996 compared to 2001, compared to today, what's improved in the country when it comes to capacity and ability to actually govern the country?
The Taliban's return to power if we could say that, has had really one major positive thing and a lot of other negative issues. And that one major positive development is that almost after about half a century, now is the time when the central government, central authority, basically has control over the entirety of the territory of the country, and that is really important. In the academic sense, in political science, we call that the basis of government. And going back to Thomas Hobbes, and as he called the foundation of a government is the creation of the monopoly over the use of legitimate violence. And so that is something that Taliban really have achieved over the past 4 years. They're in full control of the territory. There are no other opposing forces that could challenge the authority and the threat of the central government. And as such, security is much better because the war has ended, incidents of security have diminished. Only a few here and there incidents of terrorism sometimes do happen, and that is ISIL-K. But apart from that, security-wise and control-wise, things are much better. However, the Taliban then really on any other indicators of governance have had absolutely no progress. I mean, the human rights records you mentioned, human rights records are abysmal. Issues of women's rights is really, really bad. Almost half, perhaps even more than half of the country's population doesn't have access to education or to work or to public life whatsoever. The type of government is completely authoritarian, very dictatorial, in fact, very theocratic. All of the government positions and institutions are filled up with Taliban and Taliban only. And so, on all these other aspects, things are pretty bad. The economy is really bad. People are suffering from a lack of job, lack of food, lack of, all the necessary things that they need to live. If we could look back into the positive thing, that one positive issue that I mentioned is kind of paving the way. It has paved the way for the establishment and development of an effective state. But the Taliban really need to take actual steps in terms of forming a constitution-based government, in terms of a more inclusive and broad-based government, in terms of ensuring the basic rights of the citizens, and then eventually that would hopefully lead to the end of this almost total diplomatic isolation. The country can breathe again. But thus far, over the past 4 years, no steps really has been taken towards these objectives.
Yeah, it's particularly interesting the point you made. And when I was living and working in Afghanistan about a decade ago, it was very clear to me that Kabul and Kandahar were worlds away, and they might have been the central authorities, but they weren't in control. No one in the remote parts of Afghanistan saw any politicians from Kandahar or Kabul, and there was no infrastructure. And I remember speaking to some village elders in the middle of down in Helmand province, and we said to them, "Well, when was the last time you spoke to any authorities?" And they actually said, "Well, it was actually Westerners." And we went, "Oh, when was that?" And they went, 2001. And and we sort of giggled, but it was more of a giggle from embarrassment. Out of interest, we said, so, and what was the conversation you had back in 2001? And it was again one of these things that was borderline funny, but borderline wanted to make you cry. And they were almost quoting Dick Cheney, and they said, "Well, you guys promised us education, you promised us democracy, you promised us schools." And then we looked around, and all you could see for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers was dust and desert and a few mud houses. And they just looked at you, and their point was very clear. 15 years ago, you guys promised us democracy, schools, hospitals, healthcare. All I see is desert and a few mud huts. And so your response that the Taliban has managed to achieve this when no one has before them is quite an achievement. It is quite an achievement. We speak a lot in the Western media, almost exclusively talks about the negative aspects of the Taliban. And I think we all understand why. But from what I understand, the Taliban has removed and they've cracked down on other militias and other terrorist organizations. They've dismantled many of the roadblocks. They've repaired a lot of the infrastructure. There is more safety in rural communities. What else? How have they managed to achieve this level of central control when, it hadn't been possible for any of the rulers or leaders of the country beforehand?
In fact, I was in Afghanistan about a month ago on a research project, and I visited Kabul. I spent about a week in Kabul, and then went up to Herat in the west. That's originally where I'm from, and so I spent another week in Herat. Then came back to Kabul, and you could see some of these issues that you just mentioned, and in fact, in some of the meetings I had for the research purposes with some of the Taliban authorities, in fact, very high level authorities in Kabul, we talked about these issues. And in a genuine way, they were all even asking my opinion, what I think. And that's exactly what I told them time and again, very clear manner. Okay, well, you guys have achieved something that had not happened in 50 years in Afghanistan, and that is total control across the territory. But that is only the beginning of building a state. Other than that, you have achieved absolutely nothing, and you're really not working towards anything in terms of establishing a durable and an acceptable state in Afghanistan, something that most of the people, if not all, could actually see themselves in and could feel that they're part of that government. Now, the reason why they've been able to achieve this control is basically, I would say, certain, in a sense, it's by chance. And in a sense, it's a result of the 20 years of the Afghan Republic. Because during the Republic, most of the former warlords, if you will, almost all of them became part of this state. So over the 2 decades of the rule of the Republic, so the private militias kind of waned and they became weakened, and they kind of were part of the government. And in fact, in latter years, most of those militias were brought in, in terms of the actual armed forces of this state. And so with the collapse of the Republic, the only other force that came into power, it was actually the Taliban fighters. So they swept across the country with almost no to very minimal resistance in different parts of the country. So once the Republic went away, there was really no other power to challenge that. Now, nominally, there are some groups, like we have quite a number of these smaller resistance groups, if you will, the National Resistance Front, the National Freedom Front, and so on. So, but really, they are nominal. They have, I would say, almost little to no presence in the country, and they're not really able to stage any meaningful resistance against the Taliban. So in that regard, they've been able to do that, and they've also been, and you also have to give this to them as well, because a lot of people, including myself, really 4 years ago thought that perhaps the chance of the Taliban surviving as a unified group after they reached power for 4 years, that was something that was very, very difficult for me to fathom 4 years ago. But they have been able to really do that. And despite some of the differences of opinion that exist among the leadership, and there's quite a lot of that, nevertheless, they've been able to maintain that unity and unity of control. The problem is, the issue is, if you take a sort of a larger look towards the future of the country, not only some of the issues they have with women, with freedoms, and with human rights and all of that, those are very problematic. But this unitary, one-sided, forceful control, if it is not used effectively to build a durable state, this cannot survive forever. Sooner or later, fragments will happen within the Taliban. Sooner or later, resistance group will prop up, because this cannot really turn into the permanent state of the country. So my advice to them was, please seize the opportunity. After 50 years, the opportunity has come to really start building an Afghan state, an Afghan government, something that is in line with our tradition, with our religious belief, with our geography, with our politics, with our political culture, and most of all, with our financial and economic means, something that we could build and something that could sustain. And you have the chance to do that. But if you wait too long, or if you really try to pursue and force this, drag this this thing for too long, then you're going to miss the chance. And that opportunity will fade away. We will see what will happen in the near term, but right now, I don't see any indication of them really moving towards any reform.
Very interesting. And there's some geopolitical questions and domestic political questions I want to ask you, but I think some of our listeners will be quite annoyed if I don't ask you the obvious question. Ariane, you were part of the former government, but you were able to go back. How did you manage your own safety and security and risk when you were moving through Afghanistan? Because I assume the Taliban knew who you were and your previous role in the government. There must have been significant risks to you personally.
Well, they're actually quite open to Afghans returning. In fact, not only are they open, they're really asking for people. They have an entire commission, a large commission, whose task is really to reach out to Afghan politicians, to technocrats, to those who left the country, and they're asking them to return. But to return under one condition, that you do not engage in any political or security activity that would oppose the Taliban rules. So if you go there as a researcher, they're open. I went there as an independent researcher. I still do consulting work for a number of organizations. And so, in that regard, they do ensure your safety, your security. They're very open. They're very nice to you in that regard. I did not feel threatened at all. In fact, I mean, over the past 4 years, I've had two research trips, one about a year and a half ago, and then one about a month ago. The first one, I was a little bit worried what's going to happen, what's not, especially in light of what I used to do in the government. But then this last trip, I didn't feel any concerns at all. In fact, the trip I took to Herat was not even research related, because I went to see my cousins, I went to see the extended family there. It was a complete personal trip, and there was absolutely no problem. So as long as you do not do anything that would threaten them, then they are open. It's not just me. In fact, Dominic, a large number of Afghans do keep going to Kabul, to other provinces. They come back. Some of them are engaged in private businesses. Others are running NGOs. Some are just going to, see family. Others are going to look after their properties, etc. And the Taliban are quite open to that. I don't see any threat to people who just want to go and mind their own business and do not really get directly into politics against the Taliban.
And when you do research, and of course, preparing for this interview, the team were doing extensive research on the current Taliban administration. And whenever you look at the Western media, it focuses on, and when you ask and researching about what the Taliban's current focus is on, it talks about maintaining a harsh Islamic fundamentalist government, enforcing severe restrictions on women and girls, including bans on education and employment. It talks about the Taliban struggling to manage economics crisis, about managing internal factionalism and fighting against rival military groups. It paints a very, very dark, dire picture about what the Taliban is trying to do and what their focus. You've been there, you're speaking to people, you're from Afghanistan, and you know the politics very well there. What do you understand the Taliban's agenda to be? Do they want to move? Do they want to have a constitution? What do you see as the Taliban's roadmap for 2025 and beyond?
I mean, exactly as you said, once you're in the country, you could see all of that. Yes, of course, girls are not going to school, women are not going to work. Public life for women in general, and also even for men, very, very limited. Music is kind of banned everywhere. Ordinary people don't have to grow beard and wear turbans, but many people do. Those who do work in the government, they do have to have beards and wear turbans. And all these restrictions are there. In my assessment, both in talking to some of these Taliban leaders and also, spending some time, and not only spending some time there, but even much of the work and much of the research I do, even when I'm in the United States, is really focused on that region: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia, some work on Iran. But of course, Afghanistan is home, and it's a special place for me. And so much of my research is focused on that. So my assessment is that I would really say that the majority of the Taliban leaders, at least those that are in Kabul in the cabinet, the majority of them have come to understand that what they've been doing over the past 4 years cannot and should not continue. A lot of them have come to realize that if they want the current state and the current regime to continue, that there has to be at least some limited reform, at least in three things: a constitution, second, ensuring the basic rights of the citizens. Now, I'm not saying that they want, the liberal democracy type of a state that we tried to build during the Republic. That they're not talking about, but at least the basic rights, women's right to education, women's right to work, people's personal freedoms to a good extent, as much as that is in line with Afghan traditions and Afghan religious beliefs. And mind you, this also, Dominic, that Afghanistan is overall a very traditional country. So even if the Taliban are not there, I would say the majority of our people are still very traditional, very, very religious. And so in line with those beliefs and those traditions, personal freedoms, this is the second thing. And the third reform that most of these Taliban leaders that I see want is to share power, especially with the technocratic Afghans. Now, they're very much opposed. Almost every single one that I've spoken to is opposed to sharing power with former warlords. Those who had their own private armies and, they built empires and they, became millionaires, some even billionaires. They do not, under any circumstances, want to share power with them. And I think that's a positive thing to, as an Afghan, as a private Afghan citizen, to mention that. But to share power with a host of technocratic Afghans in different, government institutions, that is something that the majority of the Taliban have come to understand, that is a necessity if they wish for this regime to continue. The problem Where's the problem then? The problem is that the difference between those Taliban leaders that are in Kabul and those that are in Kandahar. And in Kandahar, of course, their supreme leader, Mullah Hibatullah, and apparently a few, sort of a small circle of clerics around him, they are very much opposed to any of this reform, that they are still of the belief that it is possible for them that they would continue with their hardcore ideological stance on government, and that they think they can actually do that. So this is the problem. In my talks when I was in Kabul this last month, every person that I spoke to, the Taliban, the international community, some of the embassies that are there, the United Nations officials that are there, some journalists that are there, everybody seems to think that sooner or later, at least these three sets of reforms that I just mentioned is going to come. But the problem is, and the actual impediment is, that Kandahar is at full power and Kandahar is really not open to any of this. Now, the question is, how and when will Kandahar be open to this? That is basically the $1 million question.
Yeah, no, that's particularly interesting. And if we look at one of the threats that we've touched on a little bit, it's around ISIS and their external operations. And I think their capability has been proven. And we also know that Al Qaeda remains quiet, but still resident within Afghanistan. The Taliban insists that it controls the threat from other militias and other terrorist groups within Afghanistan, but it's reasonable to wonder how capable the Taliban is of actually containing these threats. And we know there's been attacks in Russia and attacks in Iran and attacks in Pakistan from groups originating in Afghanistan. What does that tell you about the threats emanating from Afghanistan on neighbouring countries?
I would think that the immediate threat is not high. The immediate threat is not high because why? Because if we look at the interplay of the groups that existed in Afghanistan, and still some do exist, so basically three categories of terrorist groups, if you will. One was and is the globally oriented terrorist groups, and really there are two or three of them. There have been in Afghanistan over the past few decades, actually. Al Qaeda, the core, has been there for a long time. Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which is a subgroup of Al Qaeda that also had a presence in Afghanistan, and it is said that it still has some presence there. And then, of course, ISIL-K going back to the late 2014, early 2015. Since then, this has been there. So this is the first category, globally oriented terrorist groups with a global agenda. Then the second one is what we used to call the regionally oriented terrorist groups that don't have a global agenda, but they're also not focused on Afghanistan. Their agenda is in the region. And, Three, four of them have been prominent in the past, and it is said that some of them do still exist. We have the what they call the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM. These are Chinese Uyghurs, the minority Chinese Uyghurs that are really mainly based in the Xinjiang province of China that is bordering Afghanistan. So ETIM has been there. IMU, or the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, these are some Uzbek dissidents, Uzbek Islamist group that has had a presence. The third is Jamaat Ansarullah, that is of Tajikistan. These are the Tajiks. And then there used to be a fourth one, Jundullah, which was basically the Sunni part of Iran, and they had an agenda in Iran. So this was basically the second category. And then finally, the third category was the Pakistani group, and there has been a host of them, everything from the TTP, Tehreek Taliban in Pakistan, to Lashkar-e-Taiba, Lashkar-e-Jangvi, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Sepah-e-Sabah, you name it. I have profiles for all of them. I've worked on them for many, many years. So these groups have existed and have operated in Afghanistan for decades. They've been there. What has happened since the Taliban took over? ISIL-K, well, in terms of the global groups, global category, ISIL-K, or ISIS Khorasan province, as it's called, has really been weakened. I mean, the Taliban have been able to drastically weaken the capabilities of ISIL-K in Afghanistan to the point where ISIL-K today does not control any territory. Now, during the Republic, no matter how much pressure we put on them, we still could not clear certain parts, at least in the east, from ISIL-K, in the province of Kunar and Nangarhar and Nuristan, in the eastern part of Afghanistan. And there's some cells in northern part of the country. We could not clear those. The Taliban have been able to do that. They've completely taken over territory. So ISIL-K has basically moved from a territory holding semi-insurgent, semi-terrorist group into a full-fledged cell-based underground terrorist organization in Afghanistan. Their leader, Sanaullah Ghafari, is also known as Shahab al-Muhajir. He is believed to be in Pakistan, in the Balochistan area of Pakistan, not inside Afghanistan. But inside Afghanistan, ISIL-K still is believed to have some cells, underground small cells. The second one that is still formidable is, of course, the Tehreek Taliban in Pakistan, or TTP, which is really creating a huge security threat for Pakistan. There may be, hardly a day where one or two or several attacks do not happen in Pakistan against Pakistani security forces by the TTP. And TTP, of course, is believed to have safe havens and presence in Afghanistan. The rest of the groups that I mentioned, many other the Pakistani groups and all of these other Central Asian groups, the Taliban basically claim that they are, well, first of all, their presence is very minimal, very, very minimal. And second, that they are completely under control. Now, I challenge that because I do research on these things. I keep challenging that. So, okay, well, if you say that they are under control, show me. And then they come back as a rebuttal and say, okay, well, show me. Tell me a single attack anywhere in Afghanistan or in the region over the past 4 years that has actually originated from ETIM or IMU or Ansarullah or any of these other groups that you're mentioning. The TTP is something else, of course. ISIL-K we've been hitting, but no single incident has really happened. And it seems to be corroborated to some extent. I mean, of course, I always have off the record conversations with some American, European officials as well. The United States, of course, since withdrawal from Afghanistan, they've been monitoring the situation through what they call counterterrorism over the horizon. And so they constantly monitor the territory, mostly through the drones. And they also seem to be of the belief that none of these other groups pose any immediate threat to United States interests in the region or abroad. And the only group that may be somewhat threatening is ISIL-K. This is the interplay, but this is sort of the immediate and current scenario. The mere presence of these groups and how they could potentially morph into the future and pose another threat, that's a complete different story.
Interesting. And if we look across borders, the Kabul Islamabad ties oscillate between mediation and sometimes mutual accusations. And I think ISIS and the TTP violence are definitely pressure points. If we look specifically at Balochistan in Pakistan, that's a real hotbed of insurgency, including Afghan based groups. What's the interest in Balochistan in Pakistan, and how significant is this cross-border risk from Afghanistan in Pakistan?
Well, the Pakistani government really seemed to be struggling with two regions of two of their provinces, two of the four provinces. One is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is the former northwest frontier province that is bordering eastern part of Afghanistan, and the other one is, of course, Balochistan, that is bordering Afghanistan and Iran. So, in both of these two provinces, the Pakistani government is really struggling with maintaining control, and that had really deep rooted, deep historical roots. Because Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is, I mean, it used to be part of Afghanistan. It was then given to the British India, and then after 1947 and the partition of the Indian subcontinent, the new formation of the new country like Pakistan, it became part of that. And that is what the Afghans have always had struggled with Pakistan in terms of the recognition of that border. Afghanistan has never recognized that because the majority of the people who live in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are Pashtuns, they're Pathans, they're Afghans. And they have really not been happy with the Pakistani government that is really, by and large controlled by the Punjabis. This has really deep rooted, deep historical roots. The same thing is with Balochistan. The Baloch have had trouble accepting permanent control by the Punjabi government and Islamabad. And so that struggle is goes back decades and decades and decades. These days, it seems that both the Baloch Liberation Army, which is the larger, they call the BLA, in Balochistan, has been able to stage a lot of attacks and has been creating major problems for the Pakistani government, especially their security forces in Balochistan. And on the other hand, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you have the TTP, which is basically militant, and then you have the larger Pashtun parties and Pashtun movements that are pushing for a degree of self-governance. Now, how much of that is related to Afghanistan? It seems, at least the statistics show, that since the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan, both attacks against the Pakistani government in Balochistan and in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa have really increased. Why? Because the BLA and the TTP are believed to have safe havens and sort of a backyard in Afghanistan from which they can stage and conduct attacks there.
Yeah, it's particularly interesting. And I guess for our listeners who are business leaders and policy advisors across North America and across Europe, there's not too many business opportunities. And as I alluded to in the introduction, even if there was, they're likely to come under sanctions. But Balochistan is probably the area where most businesses may, whether it's trading, importing, exporting from Karachi, very close to Balochistan, or of course there's significant mining interest, including one of the largest gold and copper mines worth about 78 billion that's about to be opened, and that's got American, European, British backing, both government funding, funding from financial institutions, and this mixture of, as you said, from the Punjabi central administration. Is this something that's likely to be the interest to whether we say Afghan forces or Afghan militias or Baluchi, or do they see international actors as something that's not relevant? Is it really more focused on the Punjabi versus the Baluchi, or is this something that could have an international dimension that our listeners should be considering?
I mean, the international dimension of that could be assessed both in terms of the business interests and in terms of the further strategic uh, security interests as well. Now, in terms of the business interests, as you very correctly mentioned, of course, Balochistan, but not only Balochistan, Afghanistan itself is super rich with mineral resources. Now, the issues of sanctions, of course, is a problem. But many countries are already working in the mining. So the Chinese, of course, are pretty big. Over the past 4 years, China has signed over 300 mining contracts with the Taliban government. So the Chinese conduct their business there in the mining sector. Other countries in the region, including Iran and the Central Asian states, and some Pakistanis also do their business in terms of mining. And even Western countries, the Turks have, Turkey has quite a lot of business interests in Afghanistan, both in terms of import and export, but also in terms of mining. Exports, I heard, from Turkey to Afghanistan is over $3 billion per year. So that's pretty tangible for Turkey. Even Western countries are becoming kind of interested in the mineral resources there because it's rich, it's untapped, and it's really ripe and ready for exploitation. So The business dimension, of course, has a major international angle to it to be mindful of. But also, when we come to Pakistan, to sort of, if we take a regional look into it, when we come to Pakistan, Pakistan is it's a very interesting country, and it's an important country. It's a country that has over 200 million population. It's a country that is highly armed. It's a country that has, it's a nuclear power. It's a nuclear country. And inside Pakistan, fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism is really, really deep rooted. I mean, historically so, going back to the British India time, but also since 1970s with General Zia's so-called Islamization program. So Islamic fundamentalism is highly, highly deep-rooted inside Pakistan. On the other hand, you have the nuclear weapon. So the West, the international community in general, but the West has always been worried about what would happen in terms of a scenario where the Islamabad-based government could lose control, and that something similar to Afghanistan or something chaotic would happen. What would happen to the nuclear weapon? What would happen to almost 1.5 million standing army of Pakistan with all those weapons? So it does have a strategic angle to it as well when we come to international players. But the problem is that the West, particularly, of course, at the head of the West, if you will, the United States is a shifted interest completely from the region to, by and large. I remember when I entered my PhD program in 2012 at the Fletcher School. Everybody was talking about counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. That was the buzzword, and hence I did my PhD in the same field. Lots and lots of courses offered, a lot of conferences offered. Everyone is talking about it. Today, my 3 years at Princeton, completely the opposite. Nobody really wants to take a course in counterterrorism or counterinsurgency, those small wars, proxy wars, or even that region, South Asia, Central Asia region. So the buzzword now regionally, of course, is China and the Pacific, and then to a second degree, Russia. And then functionally, it's all about great power competition. So the West is really gearing up, the United States is gearing up for a long competition with China and to a certain extent with Russia. And what we are going to see, I mean, what we saw in the last couple of days, the leaders of China and India and Iran and Russia and North Korea kind of ganging up in Beijing. And what would come out of that would also be interesting to see in terms of the global power politics. In light of all of this, despite the fact that there is business interest in our region of the world, and there is some strategic interest, the focus of the West has shifted elsewhere. And so it's difficult really to bring in some emphasis in terms of the larger political players. Nevertheless, I don't think the United States or Western countries, European powers and American, Northern American powers, I don't think they have completely forgotten about that. They are watching it, but the importance they attach to that region and what is really going on in that region is, I would say, at best secondary to all these other big issues that they're dealing with and gearing up for.
And if we keep looking internationally and some of the risks originating in Afghanistan, we know that opium cultivation really crashed in 2022. And that was because of the Taliban's ban on the production of opium. And I think most people would go, "That's a good thing. That's a great thing." A part of that wasn't just the Taliban's ban on opium, but it was also Europeans' demand for it. Obviously, it's a supply and demand issue as well. And as European drug users and European partygoers have started moving towards synthetic drugs, there's actually a much less demand for the opium originally coming out of Afghanistan. And I wonder, Ariane, how sustainable is this ban, both politically but economically? And what does the ban on opium production mean economically for the farmers and for low income families that have relied on this illegal but financially important trade that occurred across the country?
Well, first, let me mention that based on some of the statistics I have seen from various organizations that work in the issue of drugs, especially UNODC, over the past 4 years, despite the fact that opium cultivation and production has dropped, as you said, by 90% or more, 95%, exports of opium and heroin have actually sustained more or less the same level. And you might ask yourself, why is that and how could that be? It is that the excess production from all those years before, many years before, production and supply was much more than demand outside. So there's major reservoirs of opium and heroin inside Afghanistan that is now being exported at much higher prices, and prices have gone up at least 6 times, both of opium and heroin. So the supply has actually continued more or less the same over the past few years, over the past 4 years, while production has dipped. But that supply also cannot continue if production continues at these lower rates. So that is basically a question of timing. Now, back to your question in terms of how sustainable this issue is, I doubt that it could be sustainable unless there is alternative livelihood programs for the farmers. Because as you know, I mean, it's not about a small number of farmers here and there. It was the majority of the farmers, the Afghan farmers in the south, many of them in the east, and many also of them in the north. That was something that they were used to doing for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, this ban has really devastated a lot of farmers. And in the absence of assistance, in the absence of alternative means that could support the farmers, this is basically, I would say, a time bomb. In fact, we're already seeing quite a lot of resistance from the farmers, both in the south. In the south, of course, Helmand was as you know, the province that would used to produce over 80% of the entire poppy crop, and now very little, if any, is being produced in Helmand. So there's a lot of resistance we could see from the farmers in Helmand, but the Taliban thus far have been able to forcefully keep that in check. How long they can use this forceful check, it's just a matter of time. At the same time, in the north, we see clashes over the past 2 years, consistent clashes against the Taliban. We see in Takhar and especially in Badakhshan province in the north, because people don't really have any other means, and especially in the north, since the territory is kind of mountainous. Badakhshan is very much mountainous. It doesn't have a lot of large flat land to be used for other crops. So high yield crops like opium was really the main thing that the farmers were used to. Again, to wrap up my talk, I think in the short term, this forceful ban and enforcement of that by the sheer use of force may be something that the people can live with. But in the long run, if this is going to continue, of course, there has to be assistance, there has to be openness, there has to be more opportunity, business opportunities, farming opportunities for the country and for the farmers. And that cannot happen so long as the country remains in absolute diplomatic isolation and under heavy sanctions.
Ariane, I'd love to hear from you as a member of the former administration in the Afghan government, and I understand you'd speak regularly to the former president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, who was the leader of Afghanistan until the Taliban takeover. There's been many comparisons drawn over the years about that the West spent 20 years trying to build up governance, trying to build up an effective defense force in Afghanistan, and then it seemingly collapsed quite quickly without many shots even being fired. And comparisons with Ukraine that I guess was able to stand firm even when Russia invaded and it almost encircled Kiev. Zelensky famously stayed, and all his politicians stayed in the country. Can you help us understand what did it look like when the Taliban was quickly advancing across Afghanistan in 2021? How did it make you feel personally, as an Afghan and as someone who was close to the government and had family in Afghanistan? And why did it happen? Why did it happen like it happened? Why wasn't there more pushback or help me and help our listeners understand the situation and what it looked like to you and maybe to others.
Well, to be clear, since the fall, I have not spoken to President Ashraf Ghani. The last time I spoke to him was exactly 2 weeks before the fall of Kabul. To be precise, that was July 31st, 2021. And exactly 14 days later, Kabul fell. When I spoke to President Ghani, I was in Atlanta, Georgia with my family, and they reached out, his office reached out and said the president wanted to talk to you. And so a Zoom call was set up later, and I had a very long conversation with President Ghani one-on-one over a Zoom call. On that day, until that day, out of the 34 provinces, only 3 provincial capitals had fallen to the Taliban. 31 provincial capital was still being held by the then Afghan government. Of course, most of the districts in the countryside had already gone, but the government was still holding 31 out of 34 provincial capitals. President Ghani asked my opinion on what needs to be done. He went, I mean, of course, he speaks very, very, point by point. He basically told me the situation is that our morale is very, very low. The ownership of war, the security forces are not taking ownership of war. Our communications is problematic. Our intelligence is problematic. Logistics is problematic. All of these issues exist there. And he also mentioned that by now we've realized, his words, we have realized that we cannot win this war by sheer military force, that we have to make peace with the Taliban. But in order to make peace with the Taliban right now are not ready for that because they think they can win militarily. So in order for us to bring them to the negotiating table, we need to prove to them that we can sustain the government no matter how much territory they win, but at least the core of the government can sustain, will sustain, and they cannot win that militarily. Now, what do you suggest? He asked me. We do. Of course, I gave him what I thought at the time could have been a solution. I'm not too sure if it would have worked, but basically what I gave him, and I'm not going to explain that whole thing in here and take your time, but I basically made a population-centric defense kind of strategy where at least 10 provincial capitals, 10 provinces, because in terms of population, Kabul at the time and even today roughly holds about 20% of the Afghan population. 20% only in Kabul. And if you add to that 8 to 9 other provinces, you easily cover about 70% of the population. So my argument, my suggestion to President Ghani was to withdraw all forces from all across the country, focus them around 9 to 10 provinces, and 3 highways that connect these provinces together and connect them to the outside of the country. Focus on that. If you can do that, you can probably sustain it for another 2 to 3 months. This is July, end of July, beginning of August. We reached winter. And of course, winter gives you a window of 2 to 3 months where large-scale offensives are not possible. Then you get yourself 6 months there, about 6 months. During this 6 months, work on a plan to sustain it for another 6 months. And if you can sustain for a whole year without the presence of a single American or NATO troops in the country, the Taliban will actually recalculate. And probably they can come back to the negotiating table and a negotiated settlement would be possible so that at least this government, the institutions we built with so much support and so much assistance and so much work for 20 years would not actually collapse. But again, I mean, as we know, things did not work that way. He asked me, by the way, during that conversation to come and join the war again as deputy defense minister, to which I said, sure, no problem. And it took me 13 days to renew. My American passport was getting expired, so I had to renew my passport to go back. It took me about 2 weeks, and on the day of the fall, I was on a plane and landed in Istanbul. Of course, that didn't happen, and not sure even if I were there could have done anything because things had really gone bad. It was basically a political defeat, Dominique, not a military defeat on the side of the Afghan government. It was a political defeat because the security forces did not want to fight because they were not sure if the political leadership had the commitment to stay. The political leadership had the commitment to sustain and make a government. Issues of corruption for years, really, really bad, high-level corruption, had really diminished any sense of ownership that the security forces had towards the country and towards the regime. The fact that the United States and NATO packed up and left, that had a big impact on the morale and the thinking of the security forces. People just were not sure if the political leadership had the will to continue.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you said is consistent with what we discussed on the podcast actually back in 2022, and I guess the analysis of many of us that this command paralysis in Kabul, different rumors, different orders, conflicting information coming out of Kabul, checkpoints flipping quite quickly, and a lot of it being really telephone diplomacy and surrenders by phone, as opposed to these battles at the gates of big cities, which I think, as you said, left a lot of officers and soldiers feeling abandoned by central authorities and confused, and as you said, choosing to live, albeit under a Taliban, as opposed to fighting and not living another day. So certainly very complex and very difficult for us to understand, sitting remotely. But no, I appreciate you unpacking that for us. And perhaps if I can ask you just one final question, Arian, if there was one thing that you could have changed or that you could have influenced at the time, if maybe you'd had your passport a little bit faster, or if you had more influence in the government in the months leading up to it, is there one thing that you would have liked to have seen the government do that you think could have made a change, a positive change?
I mean, one thing might be difficult to really single out, but if I were to single out that one thing, would have been a realization and a commitment to the survival of the state through a negotiated settlement with the Taliban when it became clear that the United States was going to withdraw. Now, this is something that is difficult for me as an Afghan American, as a person who's lived in this country for almost 3 decades and been back. I'm an Afghan and I'm American. I know this society rather well, and I know that society rather well. It is difficult for me to fathom that the Afghan leadership at the time continued to refuse the truth that one day America will leave. America was not there forever. NATO was not going to be there to stay forever. They thought that maybe, many of the Afghan leadership, they thought, well, the United States, since the end of World War II, since during World War II, has maintained presence in Japan. They have maintained presence in South Korea. They've maintained presence in Europe. So they will continue presence here because, this is a really strategic ground. I think an overemphasis on the strategic importance of Afghanistan to the West, and particularly to the United States, was in the analysis of many of the leadership, and that led them towards really denying the very fact that the United States was not there for long-term security and strategic interests. That it was a different scenario, and then one day they're going to pack. So if President Ghani realized this about, I would say, 2 years before the fall, and made a commitment for a power transition through a negotiated settlement, I would think that at least the state that was built over 2 decades, to defend which tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers died, thousands of American soldiers, European, British soldiers died and lost their limbs. Billions of dollars was spent. That state would have at least survived in such that there would have been a settlement. There would have been some Taliban, there would have been some non-Taliban, at least something that could have worked, and we would not have had what we have today: complete isolation, complete demolishing of literally all government institutions, a harsh theocratic rule by the Taliban, and an absolute isolation of the country. This could have been avoided. So if I could single out one issue, I would basically advise President Ghani 2 years before the fall to really come to that conclusion and take steps toward the realization of that.
Very interesting, Arian. Thank you very much for explaining that to us. And thank you very much for coming on the International West podcast today.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, that was a really insightful conversation with Dr. Arian Sharifi. I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on the place that the Taliban now occupy, both on the international scene but within Afghanistan, as well as the risks that are emerging and occurring from the activities in Afghanistan, and also the positions adopted by the international community. Please remember to subscribe to our emailing list to get our bi-weekly newsletter in your inbox every second week. Today's episode was produced and coordinated by Melanie Mamoon. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next few days.
you.